What if I told you that Portugal built a massive solar farm floating on water and it generates more electricity, costs less to operate, and actually improves the environment compared to traditional solar farms on land? It sounds too good to be true, right? Well, Portugal actually did this, and after 2 years of operation, the results are so revolutionary that countries around the world are abandoning plans for land-based solar in favor of floating installations. This isn't just innovation. This is a complete transformation of how we think about renewable energy, and it's happening on the surface of Portugal's reservoirs. This is that incredible story. To understand why Portugal would build solar panels on water instead of land, we need to look at the country's renewable energy transformation. Portugal isn't a large country, just 10 million people in an area smaller than Indiana. But in 2016, Portugal achieved something remarkable. For 4 consecutive days, the entire country ran on 100% renewable electricity. Wind, solar, and hydropower covered every single kilowatt. No fossil fuels, no coal, no natural gas. It was a glimpse of what's possible. But sustaining that achievement was the challenge. Portugal's electricity demand was growing. Solar energy was expanding rapidly, but solar farms require enormous amounts of land. Portugal doesn't have vast empty deserts like Nevada or Australia. It's a densely populated country with limited available land. Agricultural areas can't be sacrificed for solar panels. Urban expansion is consuming space. Where do you put massive solar installations when land is scarce and expensive? This is a problem facing many countries. Japan faces it acutely. Mountainous terrain with little flat land and high population density. Netherlands has similar constraints. Even in large countries like India and China, competition for land between agriculture, development, and energy infrastructure is intense. The traditional model, sprawling solar farms covering square kilometers, doesn't work everywhere. Then came an innovative idea. What if solar panels could float on water? Reservoirs, lakes, irrigation ponds. There are thousands of square kilometers of water surfaces worldwide that are essentially unused space. If solar panels could operate on water, you'd solve multiple problems simultaneously. No land consumption, panels stay cooler, increasing efficiency, water evaporation decreases, and you can integrate with existing hydroelectric infrastructure. The concept wasn't entirely new. Small floating solar installations existed in Japan and Singapore. But these were experimental, small-scale projects, a few megawatts at most. Nobody had attempted floating solar at utility scale. Nobody knew if it could work reliably, economically, or safely at the size needed to make a real impact on national energy systems. Portugal decided to find out. In 2020, the state utility company EDP announced plans for a floating solar farm on the Alcava Reservoir in southern Portugal. The specifications were audacious. 12,000 solar panels covering 4 hectares of water surface, generating 7.5 megawatts, enough to power 30,000 homes. This would be Europe's largest floating solar installation, and it would be built on Portugal's largest reservoir, a crucial water supply for agriculture and drinking water. The announcement triggered immediate controversy. Environmental groups opposed it, fearing contamination of the water supply. "These are industrial installations floating on our drinking water," wrote environmental scientist Dr. Maria Silva. "What happens when panels corrode? When chemicals leach? When storms tear the installation apart and debris sinks into the reservoir? This is reckless experimentation with a critical water resource." Fishing communities that relied on the reservoir protested. They worried floating panels would block sunlight, killing fish populations. Agricultural cooperatives that used reservoir water for irrigation feared contamination. Local residents questioned safety. What if electrical systems failed and electrified the water? The opposition was fierce. Engineering experts had technical concerns. Dr. João Costa, a civil engineer at the University of Lisbon, raised fundamental questions. Water moves constantly. Waves, wind, thermal expansion. The surface is dynamic. How do you anchor floating platforms that won't break apart in storms? How do you maintain electrical connections when everything is shifting? How do you prevent panels from colliding and damaging each other? Nobody has solved floating solar at this scale because the engineering challenges are immense. Financial critics question the economics. Floating solar cost approximately 15% more than equivalent land-based systems. The specialized floating platforms, anchoring systems, and waterproof electrical infrastructure added significant expenses. Why spend more for unproven technology when conventional solar was established and reliable? Portugal's energy ministry faced pressure to cancel the project and invest in traditional solar instead. But EDP was determined. They'd studied floating solar systems in Asia and identified solutions to the technical challenges. Modular floating platforms made from recyclable HDPE plastic, resistant to UV damage and water corrosion. Flexible anchoring systems that could handle water level fluctuations of up to 10 meters. Marine-grade electrical systems fully waterproofed and tested for submersion. Advanced monitoring technology to detect any leaks or failures immediately. Most importantly, EDP commissioned comprehensive environmental impact studies. Water quality monitoring before, during, and after installation. Fish population surveys. Aquatic plant assessments. Microplastic testing. They wanted definitive data on whether floating solar harmed the reservoir ecosystem. If it did, the project would be terminated. Construction began in early 2022, and immediately the challenges became real. The Alcava Reservoir is massive, 250 square kilometers, one of Europe's largest artificial lakes. Getting materials to the installation site required boats. Workers operated from floating platforms. Weather constantly disrupted work. Wind above 20 km/h made it impossible to position panels safely. Summer heat exceeded 40 degrees, making physical labor dangerous. Winter rains created waves that threatened incomplete installations. The engineering was more complex than anticipated. Each solar panel platform had to be precisely aligned. The electrical connections between floating sections needed to flex with water movement without breaking. The anchoring system required drilling into the reservoir bottom in 30 meters of water. Underwater cables had to be laid connecting the floating farm to shore infrastructure. Every component had to be waterproof, corrosion-resistant, and designed for 25+ years of operation in harsh conditions. Then came the technical innovations that made it work. The floating platforms weren't rigid, they were hinged, allowing sections to move independently with water motion. This prevented stress buildup that could crack panels or break connections. The anchoring used a catenary mooring system, like ship moorings, distributing forces across multiple anchor points so no single point bore too much load. Electrical systems incorporated automatic disconnects. If water intrusion was detected, sections would isolate to prevent contamination or electrocution. By October 2022, installation was complete. 12,000 solar panels floated on Alcava Reservoir, covering 4 hectares. The system was connected to Portugal's electrical grid. The monitoring systems were online. Now came the real test. Would it work? Would it generate the predicted electricity? Would it survive winter storms? Would it harm the reservoir? The first month of operation delivered immediate surprises, good ones. The floating solar farm generated 7.5 megawatts as designed, but its efficiency was higher than equivalent land installations. Why? Water cooling. Solar panels lose efficiency as they heat up. On land, panels can reach 65 degrees Celsius in summer, reducing output by 15 to 20%. But floating panels remained cooler. Water underneath absorbed heat, keeping panels at 40–45 degrees Celsius even in summer. This temperature difference translated to 10–15% higher electricity generation. Portugal was getting more power than they'd calculated. Energy production data from the first 6 months showed another unexpected benefit: stability. Land-based solar farms experience significant daily performance variation. Morning is cool and efficient, afternoon is hot and less efficient. But floating solar maintained more consistent output throughout the day because water temperature varies less than land temperature. This stability made the electricity more predictable and valuable for grid operators. But the real surprises came from environmental monitoring. Critics had predicted disaster, water contamination, ecosystem damage, fish deaths. Instead, monitoring revealed something remarkable. The reservoir water quality improved. How? The solar panels shaded approximately 4 hectares of water surface. This shading reduced algae growth. Excessive algae had been a problem in Alcava Reservoir. Hot summers caused algae blooms that depleted oxygen and harmed fish. But underneath the floating solar farm, algae growth decreased 35%. The water was clearer, oxygen levels were higher, and fish populations actually increased in the shaded areas. Scientists investigating this unexpected benefit discovered the mechanism. Algae need sunlight and warm water to proliferate. The solar panels blocked sunlight and kept the water cooler through shading. This created a zone where algae couldn't bloom excessively. Fish discovered these zones provided refuge during hot summers. Cooler, more oxygenated water became preferred habitat. Camera surveys showed fish congregating under the floating platforms, using them like artificial reefs. Water evaporation reduction was another significant discovery. Alcava Reservoir loses massive amounts of water to evaporation every summer, an estimated 165 million cubic meters annually, equivalent to filling 66,000 Olympic swimming pools. The floating solar panels covering 4 hectares reduced evaporation in that area by approximately 80%. While 4 hectares is tiny compared to the reservoir's 25,000 hectares, the proof of concept was clear. Floating solar could simultaneously generate electricity and conserve water. This dual benefit was revolutionary for water-stressed regions. Countries like India, Australia, and Middle Eastern nations face acute water scarcity. Reservoirs losing water to evaporation is a critical problem. That water could irrigate crops, supply cities, or generate hydroelectricity. If floating solar could generate electricity while conserving water, it became twice as valuable. Portugal had accidentally demonstrated a solution to 2 problems simultaneously. Economic data from the first-year operations surprised everyone, including EDP. Operating costs were lower than land-based solar. Why? No vegetation management. Land-based solar farms must constantly control grass and weeds growing around and under panels, requiring mowing, herbicides, or grazing animals. Floating solar had no vegetation to manage, no dust accumulation either. Rain naturally cleaned the panels. Maintenance costs were 20% lower than equivalent land systems. The panel's longer operational lifespan also became apparent. On land, solar panels endure temperature cycling, hot days, cold nights, that causes thermal stress and microscopic cracking. Floating panels experienced less extreme temperature variation because water moderates temperature. Early degradation analysis suggested floating panels might maintain performance 5 to 10 years longer than land-based equivalents, improving long-term economics. By 2023, 1 year into operation, the floating solar farm had generated 11.5 gigawatt-hours of electricity, enough to power 30,000 homes continuously. It had prevented approximately 1,500 tons of CO2 emissions. It had conserved an estimated 1.5 million liters of water from evaporation, and it had improved water quality in the covered area. Every metric exceeded expectations. International attention exploded. Engineers from 47 countries visited Portugal to study the installation. Academic papers analyzed the system. Energy conferences featured the project as a case study. Countries with large reservoirs began feasibility studies for their own floating solar farms. Portugal had demonstrated that floating solar wasn't a gimmick. It was potentially superior to land-based systems in multiple ways. India announced the most ambitious plans. With over 18,000 large dams and reservoirs, India had enormous potential for floating solar. In 2023, the Indian government approved plans for 10 gigawatts of floating solar capacity by 2030, 1,300 times Portugal's installation. If successful, this would generate enough electricity to power 50 million homes while conserving billions of liters of water annually. China, already the world's largest solar market, began prioritizing floating installations. The Huainan Floating Solar Farm in Anhui Province, built on a flooded coal mine, expanded to 150 megawatts, becoming the world's largest floating solar installation. Japan, with limited land but thousands of reservoirs, announced plans to develop 3 gigawatts of floating solar by 2030. The technology was going global. Portugal itself wasn't stopping. In 2024, EDP announced plans for a second floating solar farm on Alcava Reservoir. This one 4 times larger than the original, covering 16 hectares with 48,000 panels, generating 30 megawatts. If successful, Alcava alone could host 100 plus megawatts of floating solar, becoming one of Europe's largest renewable energy sites, while remaining a fully functional reservoir for water supply, irrigation, and recreation. The economic model was proven attractive. Analysis showed floating solar achieved grid parity, cost competitive with fossil fuel electricity in regions with expensive land or high evaporation rates. For island nations like Singapore, where land costs 1,000 PLUs per square meter, floating solar on reservoirs was dramatically cheaper than land acquisition. Singapore responded by covering 7% of its reservoirs with solar panels, generating 60 megawatts while conserving water. Environmental benefits beyond water quality emerged. Floating solar created microhabitats. Birds discovered the platforms provided nesting sites and hunting perches over water. Aquatic insects colonized the underside of platforms. Fish aggregated underneath, creating concentrated fishing zones. The installations weren't ecological dead zones. They were becoming artificial ecosystems, similar to how artificial reefs attract marine life. The integration with hydroelectric dams proved especially valuable. Many hydroelectric reservoirs could add floating solar without new grid connections. They'd use existing transmission infrastructure. This hybrid approach maximized renewable energy from single sites. During sunny days, solar generated electricity. During cloudy days or nights, hydro provided power. The combination created highly reliable renewable energy. Portugal's system demonstrated remarkable storm resilience. During winter 2023-2024, storms with winds exceeding 90 km/h hit Alcava Reservoir. Waves reached 1.5 meters, far larger than the system was designed for. Yet the floating solar farm survived intact. The flexible platform connections allowed independent movement, dissipating force instead of resisting it. The catenary anchoring system distributed loads safely. Post-storm inspection found 0 damaged panels, 0 broken connections. The engineering had worked. Technical innovations continued improving the system. In 2024, EDP tested bifacial solar panels, generating electricity from both sides. On floating installations, light reflecting off water hits the underside of panels, generating 5 to 10% additional electricity. This made floating solar even more efficient than land-based systems. Combined with water cooling and stability benefits, floating solar was generating 30% more electricity per panel than equivalent land installations. Economic analysis showed payback periods shorter than anticipated. The original installation cost $6 million. At current electricity prices and generation rates, payback would occur in 8 years, far faster than the 12-15-year estimate. After payback, the system would generate profit for 17 plus additional years of its 25 plus year lifespan. The return on investment exceeded 400%, remarkable for renewable energy infrastructure. Social acceptance transformed from opposition to pride. Local communities initially hostile to the project became advocates. The floating solar farm became a tourist attraction. Viewing platforms allowed visitors to see the installation. Educational programs brought school groups to learn about renewable energy. Fishing communities found fish populations thriving under the panels. Agricultural cooperatives using reservoir water found no contamination. Water quality had improved, not deteriorated. Employment impacts were significant. Construction employed 200 workers for 8 months. Ongoing operations required technicians for monitoring, maintenance, and security. Local companies provided boat services, cleaning, and repairs. Small businesses emerged, serving visiting engineers and tourists. The economic ripple effects benefited communities that had opposed the project, converting skeptics into supporters. Academic research revealed additional benefits. Thermal studies showed floating solar reduced reservoir surface temperature by 2 to 3 degrees C in covered areas. This cooling effect extended beyond the immediate covered zone. Thermal imaging showed reduced temperatures up to 50 meters beyond panel edges. For reservoirs experiencing excessive warming due to climate change, floating solar offered partial mitigation. Aquatic biology studies found unexpected complexity. Underwater cameras revealed fish species that rarely appeared in open water were common under floating platforms. These species preferred shaded, structure-rich environments. The platforms weren't just neutral, they were habitat enhancement. Biodiversity indices showed 15% higher species diversity in areas under floating solar compared to open water. Microplastic monitoring addressed contamination fears. After 2 years, water samples showed no increase in microplastics or chemical contamination from the floating platforms. The HDPE plastic used in platforms wasn't degrading at rates that released detectable particles. Marine-grade electrical systems showed no corrosion or leakage. Critics predicted environmental disasters simply hadn't occurred. Climate adaptation benefits became apparent. As climate change intensifies, water scarcity worsens globally. Floating solar addresses this directly, generating clean energy while conserving water. For water-stressed regions, this dual benefit makes floating solar uniquely valuable. It's not just replacing fossil fuels, it's protecting precious water resources simultaneously. The technology continues evolving. Next-generation floating solar incorporates integrated storage, battery systems built into floating platforms, storing excess daytime generation for evening use. This solves solar's intermittency problem without requiring land-based battery facilities. Prototypes in South Korea combine floating solar with floating wind turbines, creating complete offshore renewable energy systems. Automation is improving operations. Floating platforms with motorized cleaning systems keep panels optimal without manual labor. AI-based monitoring detects performance issues automatically. Drone inspections identify problems without deploying maintenance boats. Operating costs continue decreasing as technology advances, making floating solar increasingly attractive economically. Long-term environmental monitoring shows sustained benefits. Water quality improvements persist. Algae levels remain suppressed in covered areas. Fish populations continue thriving under platforms. Evaporation reduction remains consistent at 80% in covered zones. No delayed environmental harm has emerged. The system proves sustainable long-term, not just initially. Portugal's success influenced European energy policy. The EU now recognizes floating solar as a priority renewable technology, eligible for enhanced funding and streamlined permitting. France announced plans for 1 gigawatt of floating solar by 2030. Spain committed to 500 megawatts. Italy, Greece, and Poland launched feasibility studies. Portugal's experiment became Europe's renewable energy template. Global installations surged. By 2024, worldwide floating solar capacity exceeded 5 gigawatts, enough to power 2.5 million homes. Projections suggest 20 gigawatts by 2030, 100 gigawatts by 2040. At that scale, floating solar could generate 2 to 3% of global electricity, significant contribution to climate goals. And it could do so while conserving billions of liters of water and using zero land. The economic sectors benefiting extend beyond electricity. Agriculture gains from water conservation, more irrigation water available because evaporation decreases. Fisheries benefit from improved water quality and fish habitat. Tourism creates new attraction. Floating solar farms become destinations for renewable energy education. Real estate values near renewable energy installations increase as communities recognize economic benefits. Climate modeling shows floating solar's potential impact on decarbonization. If 10% of the world's reservoir surface area hosted floating solar, it would generate approximately 4,000 terawatt-hours annually. roughly 15% of current global electricity consumption. That's equivalent to eliminating emissions from 800 million cars. And it could be achieved without consuming a single square meter of land, without deforestation, without displacing agriculture. The water conservation implications are equally profound. Global reservoirs lose an estimated 360 cubic kilometers to evaporation annually, enough to meet the water needs of 1 billion people. If floating solar covered 10% of reservoir surfaces, it could prevent 30 cubic kilometers of evaporation, equivalent to a year's water supply for 80 million people. In water-stressed regions, this could be transformative. Technical challenges remain. Very deep reservoirs, exceeding 100 meters, require specialized anchoring systems that are expensive. Reservoirs with extreme water level fluctuation, 20+ meters seasonally, need adaptable mooring systems. Extreme cold regions face ice formation challenges. High wind regions require enhanced storm protection. But engineering solutions are emerging for each challenge. What seemed impossible 5 years ago is now routine. Cost trajectories favor floating solar increasingly. Manufacturing scale has increased 10x since 2020, reducing platform costs 30%. Installation techniques improved, cutting construction time and labor costs. Standardized designs allow faster permitting and deployment. Industry projections suggest floating solar will achieve cost parity with land-based systems by 2027, eliminating the cost premium entirely while retaining superior performance. Insurance industry acceptance validated the technology. Initially, floating solar faced high insurance costs due to perceived risks. By 2024, after multiple systems proving reliable through storms, insurance costs for floating solar dropped to levels comparable with land installations. This removed a major financial barrier, making project financing easier and cheaper. The Portuguese model, starting with pilot projects, rigorously monitoring performance, expanding based on results, became the global template. Countries now follow Portugal's approach. Build demonstration installations, collect data, prove economics and environmental safety, then scale up. This methodical progression reduces risk while building public confidence and political support. Corporate sector adoption accelerated. Technology companies with data centers near water, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, invested in floating solar to power facilities. Beverage companies with reservoirs for production, Coca-Cola, Heineken, installed floating solar to achieve carbon neutrality. Mining companies with flooded mines converted them into floating solar sites. Floating solar became mainstream corporate sustainability strategy. Educational institutions embraced floating solar for research and demonstration. Universities built installations on campus lakes for engineering programs. Primary schools use small floating solar arrays to teach renewable energy. The technology became a pedagogical tool, inspiring the next generation of engineers and environmental scientists. Portugal itself reaped rewards beyond electricity generation. The country's renewable energy sector employment increased 40% between 2020 and 2024, with floating solar contributing significantly. Portuguese engineering firms gained expertise exporting to other countries. Equipment manufacturers found new markets. Portugal positioned itself as global leader in floating solar technology, attracting investment and talent. Public perception shifted dramatically. Surveys in 2020 showed 45% of Portuguese people skeptical or opposed to floating solar. By 2024, 78% supported expansion. The successful Alcava installation built trust. Seeing the technology work safely, efficiently, and without environmental harm converted opposition into support. This social license enabled rapid expansion. The floating solar story illustrates broader principles. First, technological innovation solves problems conventional approaches can't. Land scarcity seemed insurmountable. Floating solar made it irrelevant. Second, environmental benefits can exceed economic ones. Water conservation, habitat creation, improved water quality, all emerged unexpectedly. Third, bold pilot projects prove concepts. Without Portugal risking $6 million on unproven technology, global floating solar industry wouldn't exist. Fourth, criticism shouldn't prevent experimentation. Every concern critics raised proved manageable or unfounded. Looking forward, Portugal plans ambitious expansion. By 2030, the goal is 200 megawatts of floating solar across multiple reservoirs, enough to power 400,000 homes. This represents 5% of Portugal's electricity generation. Combined with wind, conventional solar, and hydroelectric, Portugal could achieve 100% renewable electricity year-round by 2030, a goal that seemed impossible a decade ago. The global vision is transformative. If floating solar reaches its technical potential, covering 10% of global reservoir area, it could provide 4,000 terawatt-hours of clean electricity annually while conserving 30 cubic kilometers of water. That's solving two planetary crises simultaneously: climate change and water scarcity. All using infrastructure that already exists, the world's 60,000 plus large reservoirs, without consuming additional land or resources. What can we learn from Portugal's gamble on floating solar? Perhaps that solutions to complex problems often come from unexpected places. That combining technologies, solar and water management, creates synergies nobody anticipated. That environmental concerns, while important to raise, shouldn't automatically block innovation. That pilot projects proving concepts at small scale enable massive deployment. And that sometimes the revolutionary approach isn't just better, it's necessary. Where else could this thinking apply? What other resources are we treating as single purpose when they could serve multiple functions? Floating solar proves water surfaces can simultaneously store water and generate electricity. What about agricultural fields generating solar power while growing shade-tolerant crops? Or urban roofs providing green spaces while generating power? The principle, multifunctional infrastructure, could transform how we approach climate solutions. Portugal's floating solar farm isn't just generating electricity, it's generating possibilities, proving that humanity's most pressing challenges, clean energy, water scarcity, land preservation, can be solved together, not in competition. The 12,000 panels floating on Alqueva Reservoir represent more than 7.5 megawatts of capacity. They represent a blueprint for sustainable future where technology works with nature, not against it. And they prove that sometimes the best place to find solutions is somewhere nobody thought to look, right on the water's surface.